Hello, welcome to the next installment of Creativity in the Enneagram. Today, I'm talking with Christian Rivera. He is an sexual one, which I'm very excited about. I thought it was going to be very tricky to get my hands on a creative one, but I've done it. And he's an INTP in the Myers-Briggs system. Welcome. Yay.
Thanks. Excited to be here. Excited to have my brain picked. It's like my favorite thing for someone to just ask me a bunch of questions. So I eagerly jumped onto this. So thank you for asking.
No, thank you. So, what does creativity mean to you? Because, I often think in my very seven biased way that ones would be sort of the least creative type on the Enneagram. And I believe everyone is creative. So obviously that's a false bias on my part. And so I'm
Mhm.
really curious as a one, because I know you do a lot of creative work professionally. I'm curious to learn what it's like personally, but yeah, tell me more.
Yeah. So I've been a creative service person for 20 years, which means I've been doing graphic design, photography, video editing, all sorts of work. And what's interesting is that, like, as an Enneagram 1, I feel like my creativity manifested into something practical, which is like serving clients and helping people improve their businesses and stuff like that. Now, in terms of like the broad question of what is creativity, I feel like it's actually easier to answer that by answering what isn't creativity, because there's just so many things that are. But
Mm.
I think what isn't creativity ultimately is replication and isolation. And by replication, I simply mean just like carbon copies of things, where we often get in trouble in society for those kinds of things, like plagiarism, or when you're in school, like don't copy your friend's homework, that kind of thing, where you're not really doing any thinking at all. You're just duplicating the thing. And I work in the world of artists, where we're always trying to scrutinize whether an idea was an original idea or if it was just like literally a carbon copy of something, right? It's one thing for something to be derivative and inspired by something and pulled from an idea and inspired from an idea. That's always going to happen. But if it's just like literally copy and pasted, like if somebody took one of my wife's paintings, which is behind me, and just photocopied it and started reproducing it, like the copying of it itself, I wouldn't consider creative, but maybe the idea to try and make a business out of it or something could be creative on its own. Even that, I don't know how much that's creative personally. And then the other side of that is the isolation. It's like, if you're not getting new ideas into your brain, if you're not experiencing new concepts, if you're not looking at new work, if you're not exposed to new opportunities, to new clients or anything like that, I think that creates this isolation where you don't have anything to have a chemical response with in order to create something new. So to me, and perhaps this is a little bit of my bias as being a sexual subtype, I see creativity as like the chemical infusion of two things that creates a new thing, right? So
Hmm.
it's literally with like a pair bond partner, perhaps, and making new life, but then you can put paintbrush on paint. Those are two disparate things that you put together, and then you put that on a canvas, and that starts to create something new, fed through your brain onto a can. Like there's all these chemical reactions, there's all these things happening that create these all chemical responses that put things together that create something. And then there are situations that exacerbate creativity, like restrictions. Like I think most of the time, if we have a restriction of time, of space, of energy, we have to be creative. We have to create something new to get out of our, typically isolated situation, right? If you're contained, you need to create a possibility for yourself to get out of that containment. If you're and containment could be creative stuckness, right? Like isolated and not able to like focus on something to figure out something new. You could very well just need a push, which I know is one of the questions you're going to ask me at some point, so I'm not going to go into that too deeply. Um but I think ultimately creativity for me is combinations of factors that enable new opportunity, that enable new life, that enable new uh yeah, creative opportunities. I think it's the way I would put it. And that really helps me to think about replication and isolation as the things that I'm really trying to avoid, and really the sky's the limit with what creativity is otherwise. So as far as I know, those are kind of the two principles I kind of stay away
Mm.
from, is isolation and replication, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. And I think just for some context, you mentioned some of the professional creativity you do. Um,
Mhm.
do you have a personal creative practice as well? Before I ask you what
Yes.
creativity feels like, I just a bit of context. What do you do or make?
Yeah. So I do photography for my own self personally,
Okay.
and I also do a lot of Sharpie on paper. So I do these illustrations that are more abstract illustrations. They're more of a almost like a Rorschach test practice. It's not it's not like a portraiture or anything tangible. It's just like a lot of shapes and what comes out kind of thing. I make some music sometimes. I have a couple albums that I've recorded. I haven't made any in a little while, but I like to mess around with the bass or the guitar and sort of get into, those kind of creative flows and moments. Uh, and I think those are the things I do for myself, including some writing. I have a Substack where I do some creative writing and journaling and stuff like that too. So
Yeah, I've seen that lately. That's cool. So,
thank you.
what does the process of making feel like for you in your body?
Yeah. What's interesting being a one, it's like I'm a body type. So a lot of it is very gut centered. Like that's actually learning that I was an Enneagram one really helped me understand why, when I'm creating something in Photoshop in particular for a client, that it is a lot of like yeses and nos. Like I'm just throwing stuff around, and
Yeah.
there's this gut feeling that's just like a that's not it, or like a aha, yeah, right. It's there's this like gut knowing, and really after I learned my Enneagram type, like really understanding, I was always doing that, but I think that really gave me further permission to say like, okay, that's the right track. Like continuing to feel in my gut when there's like a yes, like full aliveness, like that's
Uh-huh.
that's right, versus like a and it usually translates to like a vocal or no, like that kind of thing. um and then I can't really describe how it feels in the gut. It's more of like it's just kind of like a tension or not tension. Right, it's like no.
Okay.
Yes, that maybe that's the best way to describe it. Yeah.
Wow, that's awesome. I mean, I know we talk about ones as having that inner tension, but to hear the way you connect to it, um, and hear it, and then it almost embody it in the way it sort of comes out, in your mouth and your jaw to go, yes, no, I love that's
Yeah.
great.
Well,
That's fascinating.
as a one, it's like that those release muscles are the important part. Like you're saying, like there's the tension. The tension's more natural. Like it's just, to
Right.
be tightly wound. I have a friend that pointed out that ones tend to have like a tight jaw, and I notice that tightness in my jaw when I'm saying no to things more often than I normally would. There's usually a tightness in my body that needs to be worked through. So sometimes I'll move my arms, I'll try to like, wiggle something loose so that I can actually like practice those release muscles. Because if those release muscles are not in tune, then I can't really tell the difference between what is a no and what is a yes. It all is just no, 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 right? So that's how it feels for me.
Wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't realized that being in a more relaxed state helped you differentiate more and be more aligned with what you're making than when you were in a more tense state, because then the tension just takes over everything.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a big believer in contrast reveals all things. And that's just like one of my core principles. And if I don't have that opportunity to create that contrast, then I'm going to be stuck in whatever box that I'm in. So being an Enneagram one in more of like a tight, no controlled state is not giving myself the contrast to know what I actually need or want or can create or what I can respond to or any of those things. It's just a perpetual no. And my wife will usually point out to me when I'm just like repeatedly saying no to things or pretty closed off or anything like that. And I'm self-preservation repressed, which means like, sexual is my sort of main instinct, social second, and then self-pres is something I don't really think about as much, but she'll help me notice when I'm, kind of in the more tighter, closed off, like
Right.
really restricted kind of one controlling state. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And what else did you learn when you discovered you're a sexual one? Like what else?
Mhm.
How did that change your creative practice?
Well, funny enough, when I learned that I was a sexual one, I actually thought I was a seven when I was in my 20s, because I'm an INTP. So I was also activating what's called extroverted intuition at the time, which is a growth sort of space for INTPs. And so I thought I was a sexual seven at the time. And then I thought I was a five because I started to kind of level out and everything was cool. And I actually started doing some work with my friends at Personality Hacker. I primarily freelance with them. And we were doing some work with Beatrice Chestnut and Rania Paez, who are big in the Enneagram world. And I learned a lot through editing those programs for them. But it was actually while I was editing those programs and they were discussing the sexual one that I realized, like, oh crap, I think I'm a one. and and because I noticed myself just like projecting over and over again, where I was like, oh, that sounds like my dad, oh, that sounds like my brother, that sounds like this person. And I was being kind of judgy, and I was like, they're being kind of judgy about ones. And I'm like, I never really explored Enneagram one, and I'm like, why am I so sensitive to judgment? And I'm like, oh no, I think I'm a one. So interestingly enough, in the process of editing all of that, I
Mm-hmm.
realized how meticulous I was being in that project. And it was actually lengthening the amount of time I was spending on the project. Like I was being so nitpicky about timing, the audio, the way things sounded, the way things looked, like to the pixel. And I've always been a bit of a pixel pusher. Like I've always been very willing to get it right, get it perfectly, maybe not measured exactly, but at least like relatively balanced so that everything looks precise. And I will, tinker and tinker and tinker and tinker. And it was really in that moment of learning that I'm a sexual one that I was like, I tinker too much.
Mm,
I to the point where it's become a detriment. Like I mentioned with like replication or like nitpickiness, it's I was clinging to the parts of the creative process that were not creative. Like just measuring and moving
right.
things, it's not really, I'm not really creating anything. I'm just trying to line things up. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's, and almost like getting obsessed with that was keeping me away from continuing to be creative and continuing to allow myself to be like in the organic letting go process. Like I said, with like the release muscles, my tension muscles were just on too much, and I was being too precise, and it was eating away time, and that project took way longer than it needed to. And because of that awareness, I was like, all of my past projects have probably taken way longer than I needed them to, because I was being needlessly precise or fighting back against like account managers who were giving me like little notes or things that executives needed or things that I didn't think were actual like valid criticisms that I would push back against all the time. And that would keep me from being in a good flow and having good rapport with the people I was working with. I was just being like, a real pain in the butt about it all.
Oh, when you mentioned, getting the feedback from, we'll just say clients, and pushing back on it because of relevant. I know when I got that feedback, I'd be like, I have a full on, internal meltdown about like, "Oh, how dare they? How dare they?"
Yeah, yeah. I get angry. Like that was my,
Yeah. Okay.
being a sexual one, like I deflect criticism. So it was always like, you know, for account managers in particular, account managers are people who basically would like filter the requests to me from a
Okay.
client or something like that. And those account managers, sometimes I did catch them in a moment where they would give me a bit of feedback And I would literally just send them back the same thing that I sent them before. And then they were like, great. And I was like, okay. So my theory of you just making a comment because you felt like you needed to in order to feel like you're doing your job, it wasn't invalid. But there were
Hmm.
times I used that excuse too much. And I was just like using any kind of deflection to say, like, you're just trying to prove your value as your job, or you don't know better than I do because I've been a designer for a long time. You're just a messenger. You're just communicating, I was being a real jerk and communicating any little pushback of and really feeling a charge in my body, usually. Like,
Okay.
like when you, it's like instead of having those release muscles and like laughing about it and saying like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, let me just make this adjustment, kind of flex and flow with it. It's like I was gripping tighter and I was just like, this is, no, this is wrong, this is,
Mm.
you don't know how to give criticism. You don't know how to give constructive feedback, and I've blown up in meetings in the past because of that.
Right.
I'm far less overtly angry than I used to be, but I was definitely um, more in tune with the anger in response to people's criticism of my creative choices. And sometimes it was, I mean, in retrospect, a lot of it was definitely valid because as a one, I still noticed myself preferring to just do the practical, easy thing. Like, they gave me a request. Let me do the lowest common denominator version of this request. Let me get it done in the time frame that needed to be done, and not request extra time or not reinvent the wheel, which was something that, as a creative person, part of creativity, to kind of add more to the first question, I think part of creativity is like being willing to persist and push and iterate, right?
Mm.
My wife, she's a painter, and she runs an ugly art night, which she's running right now at our studio space outside somewhere. And she runs this process where she creates, she gives everyone canvases and paints and all of this stuff, and you just make a mess. She puts on music and you just like scribble and kind of let go. It's kind of a perfection releasing catharsis process. But at some point, she usually comes around with black paint and just starts squeezing it on to the canvas and say like, okay, we're done being, because there's a point where you start to get precious about the work. And she wants to disrupt that. So she'll give you suggestions like, start painting with your left hand. Or if you're doing a lot of wide scribbles, maybe do something like more precise, and change it up in that way. So I've had to learn to change up my process, to be more iterative, to maybe disrupt it and blow up what I think is working and try something else just to see what happens, instead of getting too tight and too precious and too attached to what I think is the right thing.
Mm. And that it's interesting thinking about feedback because throughout my career, the feedback that's been hardest to dance with and consume has been about my creative choices because there is
Mm-hmm.
still something sensitive about that. There's, you're slightly more attached to it than maybe other sort of professional work.
Mm-hmm.
And from my personality's perspective, it was very much a growth point of having to work with that,
Mm-hmm.
for the reasons you're saying, because you're like, well, it's not invalid. And it doesn't necessarily make, when I make those changes, it doesn't make the work worse. It might actually make it better. It's just that
Right.
maybe I didn't see it or, whatever that might be. So yeah, it's interesting
Yeah.
you point that out.
And I really learned a process from Seth Godin. He's like a master marketer, creative person. And he has a process called thrashing, which is basically means that when you have a project, especially with a deadline for a client or something like that, to to take it to 80% as quickly as possible, and within your own process as much as possible. Meaning that whatever that first 80% version of the project is, that is my thing, that is my baby, that is what I want the outcome to actually be. But then I present it to the client and they usually have feedback. They want me to make adjustments. And it takes a lot of time for something to get from 80% to 90%. And it's usually in that process that my release muscles become more valuable to let go. At this point, what I created is not mine anymore. And that's something
Mm,
I think a lot of creatives could really benefit from, is like having, yes, have attachment to the process, because you're making decisions, you're making representations of yourself onto the page or digitally or whatever it is that you're doing. So there is certain pride in that, and you're bringing your experiences, you're bringing your knowledge, you're bringing your expertise, your taste to those experiences. But at a certain point, you know, bureaucracy could take over. The executive and the marketing needs might take over. What someone believes is the demographic need might take over. Or just like, I worked in film and TV for a little while, and sometimes during the creative process, the overall branding of like a movie might change. So a color choice that I made that I really got attached to and loved changed because the overall tone of the movie changed. So it was really like needing to learn to be adaptable, especially working in like a team environment, to have like my precious personal creative process and honor and love that, and also create like I would keep a version of that project for me, like this is mine, this is what I made, and then
mm,
allow the new thing to be adaptable, adjustable, malleable, to let that grow. It's sort of like a similar feeling to like having a child. It's like you have a child and you're attached to it, and you're like, this is going to be a little me and it's going to grow up to be exactly like me and every little thing about it is going to be mine. But then at a certain point it's like, oh no, this is its own thing. They're their own person. They have their
mm,
own wants, their own needs. Like, suddenly they don't like apples, and you're like, neither of us dislike apples. Where did they get that from? Right? Like they are their own thing.
yeah.
Every creative baby of sorts is like, it starts to, you need to give it time to have its own identity. And
Mm,
that's part of the creative process that my wife walks people through, is like, at some point, this is not yours anymore. This is like something that's evolving. It's starting to almost talk to you, which is, sounds a little esoteric, but
mm,
it's like that's the practice that I do when I'm doing some drawing on the page, and I'm looking at it, it's almost telling me what it needs next, versus like me trying to dictate what it's going to be. That's when things get rigid, that's when things get tight, that's when things don't actually organically evolve into what they ultimately need to become.
mm. Yeah, and your wife's art class sounds amazing. Like I really wish I could take that. That sounds so
It's
cool.
a lot of fun. She's doing a digital one in October. I'll talk to you about it
Ooh,
separately. I
okay.
don't have the exact dates, but
Let's do
I'll
that.
I'll let you know
Um,
personally.
so over the course of your career, I'm sure that you've wrangled with creative blocks. And I think there's two types of blocks that I'm interested in. One is sort of the ones that feel really big, that they're sort of almost, there's a sabotage piece, they're attached to some sort of, deep wounding. And then there's the, I just can't get this thing to go, they're like there's big and the small blocks. And I'm curious, have you experienced both? And, what did you do to move through them?
I kind of imagine what you were saying as like both a fear of failure and a fear of success. It's like sometimes there's this fear of success of like, what happens if this thing goes well? And that could create this inner blocker. It could create this moment where it's like, I don't actually think I want to go further with this, because what's on the other side of this might be a little scary to me.
Mm,
And then the other side of that is fear of failure, which is, again, I think mostly other people's voices in our heads saying that like, this is not going to be good, or we're not valued, or anything like that. I think it's these two sides of like lifting ourselves up too high and saying like our work has this massive impact on the world that's going to change everything, and so you're putting too much pressure on it, and therefore nothing's coming out. It's like trying to squeeze something so tight that nothing's coming out the hose if you're watering your
mm,
plants or something. And then the other side is like, you're probably not putting enough of yourself into it to make something happen. You're experiencing a lot of the pressures from the outside world, or other people's voices of like shame or guilt, or interjecting maybe someone else's feelings about their creative work or something like that. So to bring that to a little bit more of a practical level, I think that um, when I get creatively stuck in a way that is more of the first kind, where I don't know really where to get going, I just need to start making something, right? I need to
ah,
let go of the attachment to it, to a specific outcome, because that just doesn't work for my brain as an INTP in the Myers-Briggs system. Like I don't, if I think too much in my head about a project, it'll either live in my head and never meet reality, or I'll just keep kicking the can and nothing will ever happen. So I need to just get in front of the page and start writing something. Even if I'm literally saying, I'm writing something right now, I wonder what's going to come out of my brain, right? And starting to get the engine revving a little bit. And so there's a certain humility and dignity to it all, meaning that, like, you have to have the humility to not think that this thing I'm going to write is going to put my entire creative work and life at stake. It's like this, even if you're writing a book and it's something that's big and takes a long time, it's you're going to edit it over time, you're going to iterate over time, you're going to have different moods and feelings over time. It's a slow process. It's like, take an hour a day to sit and write whatever comes out. Stop putting so much pressure on yourself for this book to, like, I don't know, change the world or define your entire essence of a human being. You can't do that in words anyway. So good luck. It's like, it becomes a whole thing. And then the other side is dignity. It's like humility to the point where, like, you're not pushing yourself to a self-deprecating negative place, but you have enough dignity to value your creative self, to get started in the first place. And it feels like those two extremes, either overvaluing ourselves to the point where it's just like this big picture creative block where we're not getting anything done because we're just arrested by the possible outcomes. And then the dignity part where it's like, yeah, but we also are a creative person, that our voice is important for the world, our unique experience. We are the cosmos experiencing itself. We have inherent value in that sense. And so start writing, because your voice is valuable and deserves to be heard, or painting, or whatever it is that you're going to do that's a creative contribution to reality, right? So it's this balancing point. It's humility and dignity, I think, are these, like, really important ballasts to, like, if you find that middle point and you just show up and you start making, you give yourself a little bit of time every day, that builds and that compounds, especially with time pressure. We had so much stress to our lives because of perceived, what's the word? Perceived urgency that isn't always there. You're not going to write a book in a day. It's just not going to happen. It's just not practical. And so giving yourself that incremental time every day to do a creative practice, to be a part of contribution to the cosmos in some way, shape, or form, and to expanding sometimes what counts as creativity. Molly and I get this comment all the time when people see our work. They're like, I don't have a creative bone in my body. That is a flipping lie. Creativity manifests in so many different forms: building businesses, solving problems, interconnectivity, relationship, being able to have small talk and banter and connect. And right now we're creating something, for people to witness, right? And it's going to be put somewhere for people to be able to experience. And then they get those thoughts put into their brain, and they might get inspired to go do something themselves. So there's so many different versions of creativity, which is why I said at the top that it's easier to define what isn't creativity than it is, because there's just we're doing it all the time.
And I think we forget that every, the building a relationship with someone is a creative act, because it requires problem solving and creative, thinking differently and empathy and all those things. But I'm loving what you're saying about when we're overvaluing and undervaluing ourselves, and how both of those create a disruption of flow in some cases. Because I was thinking about, I was sending out something new. I created something yesterday. It's a contract, but it's very personal. It's taking something and doing it very differently. And I was thinking, unconsciously, oh, if I send this out, everything's going to come to an end. This will just disrupt the universe. And you're right. I'm overvaluing the amount of impact my one little contract can have on things, and how, it's bringing yourself back into perspective without taking away your voice. It's going, yes, you have a voice. Yes, it needs to
Mhm.
be out there, but it's not going to, disrupt the, time space continuum as the way you currently think it might. I think
Right,
that's a
exactly.
really great framework.
Thank you. I think that balance is super important. And I think I do feel like I have a little bit of an advantage as a body type in the Enneagram, because that really helps me to I'm typically trying to be present. I'm trying to be direct. I'm trying to do something that's practical. The challenge that I've had is making sure to expand to not be so practical all the time. And in that expansion, I've had to wrestle with these two extremes, with overvaluing my impact, which is, I think, something I would lean into a little bit more than undervaluing myself. But even then, like you mentioned traumas briefly, like traumas can create a movement in either of those directions. And, sometimes that's work with therapists or deep inner work, shadow work, all of that stuff that can unlock a wellspring of creativity, because we're kind of locked into one of those things, because we have maybe our parents' voice in our head telling us we have to amount to something that saves the world, or our cousin's voice that criticized us all the time and made us feel like garbage all the time.
Mm,
Those are things that we have to unravel and unlock and let go to be more freeform and creative in our lives on a regular basis.
absolutely. So I think like one thing I'm curious about now is what is a couple of the things, or one of the things that you're most proud of, that when you think about creating it, it gives you, well, what I would say the warm and fuzzies, but it might, your inner world might be different when you think about what creative work you're most proud of.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised at what came up. I was kind of just like listening for what the gut reaction would be, but I created 3 instrumental albums within the last 5 to 7 years. And I think those are the things that I'm most proud of, because they have a lot of personal influence from like pop punk, like Blink 182, Sum 41, like all of those influences, a lot of older punk influences and stuff like that. That those were projects where I was like, I want to make my version of it. I want to make an album that I want to listen to. And I did it. and and it's one thing when I've worked in graphic design and I've worked in marketing, I've worked in news, I've worked in fast-paced industries where we have to create a lot of things, like crank out a lot of stuff. And one of the biggest challenges these days is we have to make so much work for like social media, newsletters, uh, constantly cranking out stuff all the time. For me to have taken these projects and do um, a couple of albums that took time to make, that was slower, more intentional, more personal. Like these are kind of abstract expressions of myself
Mm,
that had certain themes in it. Like there's a song that's about domestic abuse and stuff that I experienced when I was a kid, that translated through the cadence of the song. It didn't have words in it. I'm There's a couple songs that do have me singing on them, but I'm not much of a singer. I'm more of a punk rock, like kind of thing, right? And it was really nice to allow myself to do that, but I felt more in flow just making those uh, abstract albums. So those are nice because I can go back and listen to them regularly. And
mm,
with a lot of the work that I've done, like they've kind of disappeared into social media. They disappear in the ether. Or if an artist creates a work and somebody buys it, you might not see that work ever again. And there's something about having that music reflected back to me that not only is a time capsule for that period in my life, but also reflects who I am now and how I listen to it now. So it's kind of an ever evolving art in a weird way, or at least that's my like kind of spiritual cosmic woo woo way to look at it in a sense. And I appreciate it for that. And then the other thing is I wrote a book called Happy Chemicals, a Neurotic Memoir, which was another long project that was a really it was a process of letting my there's like a dorsal part of the brain here, like right behind the prefrontal cortex, that is the basically the inhibitor. It's like when people drink, it's like that's what loosens up, or when someone smokes weed, that's what loosens up. And so it was a practice of loosening that up and seeing what came out of my brain, seeing what I would just write about as I was like almost witnessing my neurotic thoughts about whatever. It was part comedy, it was part shadow work, it was part ego exploration, and it was just like a lot of fun to put on the page. I wrote about being a dictator at one point. Like it was just like kind of a weird, wild exploration of like a radically honest version of myself. And I'm really proud that that exists and it's out there and people have read it, and it just means a lot to me. So those kind of bigger picture projects, which I don't do very often, those are the ones that feel really good.
And I love that you can go back and revisit those, as you were saying, as a point in time and space, and seeing how you've changed or evolved since then, or how they're influencing you now, almost, it's this infinite cycle kind of way, um, as those kinds of work can be. And
Yeah.
I didn't often do that. I've had that conversation with a very similar conversation with the sexual aid, actually, about going back and reflecting on one's work. And it's not something I do, but I feel like there's going to be a lot of value in that kind of practice that I might need to start incorporating in some way.
It's nice to do every once in a while, and you'd be surprised what you get from it. Witnessing your past self. It's like, I don't know. We always talk about this idea of giving a gift to our future selves. And when I created those albums, like that was a gift for my
Mm,
present self. So it's rude to not accept a gift. So I'm gonna accept it
yeah.
and give it a listen and learn from myself where I can.
Yeah. I think the closest thing I've got to that is when I was going through all of my photos, because I used to be a prolific sort of photographer. And, once everything got digitized, you stopped looking back. You didn't flick through photo albums the way you used to. And I went back
Mhm.
and looked at a photo of me from, almost 20 years ago. And I think in my mind, that person was very different. But when I looked at the photo, I went, we're exactly the same, you know,
Huh?
they're
Mhm.
the same person. And yeah, so doing that I found really valuable too.
Yeah, and the evolution of ourselves is usually much more nuanced than we'll give it credit for. And like you mentioned, it's like so much is digital. I think about the day when everyone panics and realizes that like all of my kids' photos are on Facebook and Facebook's about to like shut down. This is like 30 years from now or whatever, right? And it's like I don't have any tangible physical photos of my kids, or I don't have tangible photos of like the photography I took, or something like that. Everything's so digitized that there is this like missing tangible
Mm,
element that I think is like it's becoming something to be more conscious of than we've had to be in the world we're in as of this recording. So I
mm,
would encourage that to someone listening. Like if you have things that are physically tangible that maybe you haven't given attention to, or something that you look back on or would like to look back on that is now in digital form, like run it through Google Photos and print some stuff and have it up in your house. And I mean, I'm grateful for my wife and these paintings that catalog elements of her life and her creative process. I have a couple of my drawings up too. And it's
mm.
just really, having those physical things is just a ever present reminder of that we're moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I look for all my stuff's in storage. So I look forward to the day where I can put those things up and yeah, have that interaction on a daily basis. So I think my last question is, what supports you to be creative?
Oh, lots of things. Well, first of all, opportunities like this from lovely people like you who are asking me questions, really great questions that I get a chance to just like, I don't know, step out of my body and answer questions and not know what's happened. Like I'm blacked out right now. When this is over, I'm gonna wake up and be like, I hope that went well.
It's going
um,
great.
okay, awesome. Great. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, it's a perpetual calibration to have things in my environment that support me. I mean, we're surrounded by books, so there's creative moments and opportunities to look in those, not only from a conceptual level, but we've got stuff from like artists that we can look in and get some inspiration from. But my wife's art is everywhere. She's an artist. She supports me. If anything, she pushes me to have those release muscles more than anyone else, because she's she buys into my creative potential more than I do, and she's pushed me along, and I've been able to make things that I didn't think I would on my own. So it's been really lovely in that sense. My kids, I have stepkids. I see them every other weekend, and they are just like these pure ego id expressions of like play and want and all of this stuff that, like, yes, can be annoying as a parent, but they often push me out of my comfort zone to be creative, to be playful, to move my body, to be expressive in ways that, two adults at home don't do as easily on our own. So that sort of natural energy of being around kids is such a supportive force as well. Obviously, having some materials around is always nice, like access to things. Ever since I bought this, I have one of the newer MacBook Pros, and I was lucky to be able to get one last year. And before then, I was working on this big, cumbersome PC where I was stuck in a corner of my room and didn't have a lot of freedom. Being able to get this tool to be able to move around freely, to do things a little bit more on my own time, to not be stuck in a specific space, like that was really helpful. So like tools, the environment, people I'm surrounded by, all of those things absolutely support my creative endeavors, and also continuing to do growth work. Like I
Mm.
mentioned, like the humility and dignity thing, it's like that's an ongoing calibrative process because we're getting feedback from the outside world all the time, and we need to take that in and balance the scales pretty regularly. And getting better at that is really allowed me to keep those tension and release muscles healthy. It's like literal physical muscles. It's like if they're too tight, they're not going to operate. If they're too loose, you're not going to be able to lift anything. It's just kind of a,
Mm.
I don't know, to me it's a principle of the universe to have this tension and release, ones and zeros, up and down, breathe in, breathe out. That kind of thing is an ever-present principle that I bring into everything I do, hopefully.
Mm. Yeah. And I think how for me as a 7, it's always how do I bring in a bit more structure and focus to balance out, all the other, the gluttony pieces. And,
Right.
I live with a toddler and I've done so for a year now. And learning to play physically, like you're playing in a whole different way. And I think as an adult, it's really great to get down to a kid's level and try and meet them where they're at rather than try and
Mhm.
dictate what the play can be or what they have to do. But it's really hard to let go. And
Yeah.
I'm finding it a really great experience.
And it really just like, I don't know, the kids just like pull you out of your own stuff. We're so in our heads about like what's happening in the world, or like what's my important project going to do for the world, or like, I don't know, whatever, right? It's like the kids are just like, I don't care. I just want to watch Bluey and do the thing and sing the song and just throw me. Like it doesn't matter. And
Yeah.
I think kids really helpful to get back to that like place of like, oh, I was this. I came from this. This is in me still. This playfulness is a part of me. So like
Mm.
it's it's wonderfully serendipitous that you're a 7 having this conversation with me, because that's a part that I've needed to grow into, is allowing for that 7 arrow to really unlock in my life, to have more creative ideas. My stepdaughter is a 7. I think she's an ISTJ social 7. And she is a weird combination, first of all, but she's just like zany in a way that like I really respect how many ideas she has. She's always like, I want to do this. I want to do this. Let's try this. Let's do this. Sometimes it gets too much and I can't promise certain things that she wants. But there are moments where she's like, everybody stop. Let's play a game together. And I'm like, you know what? I would not have thought to do that. And
Mm.
that's like, as much as every Enneagram type can have like their neuroticism that really like becomes a problem for everybody at some point, it's also like at its healthiest providing gifts to the world.
Mm.
And she brings that gift to me. And also my wife is a self-preservation 4, so I'm surrounded by healthy examples of arrow line movement that I get a lot of encouragement from my wife to creatively express and be in the liminal space and be in the process and be in your feelings and all of that stuff. I have to kind of like embody what she's how she expresses that. And then my stepdaughter is just like, I don't know, let's just go crazy. And I'm like, you know what? That is the exact balance I'm looking for. Crazy emotions and just expressing myself and not getting so much in my own, like, okay, I got to pay the bills and I got to just wake up and take a shower and like that's so damn boring, right? So having this release has been a gift from
Mm.
people around me, and having people like you show up and ask me such delightful questions and bring such wonderful conversation to the table.
Oh, well, I love that you're living with your arrows. That's absolutely wonderful. I'm sure that's supportive and challenging in its own way. And it's been wonderful to chat with you. I've really learned a lot and taken a lot from this conversation. So thanks for showing up and being you and sharing your wisdom and experience with me and us. It's been great.
Well, thank you so much. It's been my honor and pleasure to be here. I'm happy to come back at any time for whatever you need.
Ooh, excellent. I will hold you to that at some point in the future. Get ready for a random project. It's going to come your
Sure.
way.
Let's go. I'm ready. I got those flex muscles ready to go.